So the Lumix S5 has been my main camera body for the past 3 years now. Given I've had it so long, and it's also the top of 2026, I think I'm finally ready to share my thoughts on it. If you're new here, my name is Stan, and I'm a filmmaker and photographer based in Seattle, Washington. I originally bought the S5 as an upgrade to my first camera, the Lumix G85. And if you're familiar with Lumix cameras, you know that previously, before they started making primarily full-frame cameras, they had a great line of micro four thirds cameras that they offered. I sort of started my whole video and photo journey on that camera. And given I love that camera, there came a time where I was ready for an upgrade. And looking back, I don't really think I knew what I wanted from a camera. I just knew that I wanted a full frame camera, log, some better resolution, and maybe even autofocus. And given that this was a Lumix camera and the button layout was similar, I was already familiar with the menu interface, and the S5's price even back then seemed to be pretty reasonable, especially in comparison to the other full frame cameras within this caliber. But fast forward 3 years later, I feel like I'm a lot more confident in my knowledge about cameras and what I would want from a camera, especially when it comes to the S5. And Lumix themselves have already dropped successors for the S5, the S5 II, the S5 IIX, and the S5D, if you count that. And I think in all of that, the S5 becomes this camera that can easily be forgotten or overlooked, and maybe even considered as not an option, which I just don't think is true. So today, I want to share with you a more long-term review of the Lumix S5. I like to cover some of the stuff I think is important and whatever else I deem relevant. So to start, let's cover some of the basics. The S5 was originally released in August of 2020. This is a full frame 24 megapixel camera. And nowadays you can find this camera as low as $800 that I'm finding. I went to my local camera store a couple of weeks ago and I saw they had 2 used S5 bodies for about $799. And I'm sure if you look hard enough, I'm sure you could maybe go on eBay or elsewhere and maybe find an S5 with a kit lens thrown in with it. And honestly, in that price range, the S5 is probably the most value-packed camera that you can get on the market right now. Looking at the body, the S5 is small, it's compact. The S5 has a standard SLR build, has an electronic viewfinder, has a fully articulating LCD screen. The body of the camera has ports for audio, external monitoring. This camera is also packed with things like zebras, histogram, and a bunch of other great video and photo focus features that are great to have when you need them. And there's definitely a ton to unpack when it comes to the internal navigations and things like that with the S5. However, I think for this video, I like to focus on more of the core features of the camera. So let's start with one of the things I think is really great about this camera, and it's stabilization. So the S5 has a number of different stabilization modes that it offers. It has its standard IBIS, which works by physically moving the camera sensor to compensate for shakes and all the other stuff that happens when you're using it. It has E-stabilization, which works by doing a digital crop to help stabilize footage. And then it also has things like IBIS Boost, which does it in a more extreme crop. And then it also has some anamorphic stabilization modes if you're using anamorphic lenses. Now, with all those different stabilization modes built in, I find that the S5's base stabilization works quite well. And it's still some of the best that I've used when it comes to the full frame cameras that I've gotten my hands on. I think it still holds up great today. And looking back, I've had my S5 in so many different unstable circumstances, and to be honest, keeping a steady hand has always just been my friend. If there's ever a case where I needed more, I'd toggle on E-stabilization or maybe even IBIS Boost if I needed to. Though I'd say that a lot of times that ends up being overkill, especially if you're just out in the street recording something or maybe doing something where it isn't too much of rigorous movement involved. However, with that being said, there are some times where you might be doing like a more run and gun shoot, you're doing something more handheld, you have the camera rigged up, then you can use things like E-stabilization, the IBIS Boost. If you're using anamorphic glass, like I said, the anamorphic stabilization features, and you have all of these different things that can help you if you do need it, if you are in a situation where you just need a little bit more stability for your footage. In my use case, I mostly use lenses that do not electronically communicate with the camera. So that means that I have to manually set my focal length. That way the camera knows how to stabilize based off of the lens that I'm using, which I highly recommend doing if you are using cine glass or any vintage glass, whatever you're using. Setting things like your focal length will help a lot, especially when you're out shooting, like I said, with anything that isn't electronically communicating with the camera. But I think most of us should be familiar with stabilization that you can do in post. And to be honest, when I go out and shoot and I come back if for whatever reason something is a little bit off, I can always nip it in the butt in post-production. So, when it comes to the S5's base stabilization, works perfectly fine for my use case. And then if I need a little bit more, I have some things I can do internally for it, like stabilization, IBIS boost, that work fine. But then if I still need more, then I can simply go into DaVinci and stabilize just to get my footage as smooth as possible. But overall, if you keep a steady hand, that will go a long way. And honestly, if you have this camera, you likely know that stabilization is not a pain point at all. So moving on, let's talk about image quality. I think one of the most important questions that someone has when they're considering buying a camera is how good is the image quality. I think if you look around online and you look at the things people are making with the S5, I think the S5's resolution still holds up with what we would deem as acceptable nowadays. The S5 shoots at a max resolution of 4K, 422, 10-bit, and at this point, it's all I ever shoot in. I should mention that for the first 2 years or so with the S5, I primarily shot in a more compressed image format, which is 4K 420. And the reason why I did that is because back then I had a Intel MacBook still, and it just couldn't handle the larger MOV files that the S5 produced. So I shot in a more compressed image format. That way I could, actually play back footage somewhat, and it worked quite well for me. And the only reason why I mention that is because for a lot of the projects that I shared on YouTube, I was shooting in a more compressed image format, and I don't think anybody noticed, which I think is a testimony to how great the image quality is. And additionally, I think the S5 is sharp, but it isn't too sharp. And I think that's the appeal to this camera, that it does have a more or less organic looking image that comes out of it, especially given that this is not a camera that has an optical low pass filter that you see lots of cinema cameras have. The fact that this camera can still give you quite the sharp looking image, but still not something that looks too clinical or too digitally processed, that is one of the things I love about this camera the most. And the S5 has a 6K sensor built into it, and I think people often can forget that about this camera. And I haven't needed to use it, but if you pair this camera up with something like a Ninja Atmos V, you can shoot 6K 12-bit ProRes RAW footage. And I think at the price, that's an absolute steal. You're not really finding that with any other camera at that price range. But overall, the resolution on this camera is something that I don't think is anything anyone will ever be disappointed in. Something else I think is directly tied to the image resolution on this camera is how great the low light performance is on it as well. The S5 has a dual native ISO system built into it, and I won't try and even explain the technical background behind it. Not that I really understand it anyways, but I think I have gotten questions about, low light performance and, how I keep a clean image when I'm shooting in lower light conditions. And I think the easiest thing to understand is that this camera has a low gain and a high gain. The low gain is at 640, the high gain is at 4000. To simplify, if you're shooting in low light,
you should be staying in between 4000 to 6400 and essentially avoiding the 1600 to 3200 range.
I say if you can, don't go above 6400. However, I have many times when I've needed to. Honestly, you can't forget that you can denoise in post-production. And, if I really need to, if I do need to denoise for whatever reason, I can.
And I'll try and put up here some examples of when I've pushed my camera past 6400 and how the noise looked then, and then how it looked after once I did some denoising. So to summarize this section, the S5 is a low light camera, and ultimately learning how to properly use this camera's ISO system will help you be able to produce a clean looking, sharp image, and no matter what the lighting conditions are.
Especially when you're using faster lenses that can go to wider apertures. And then also, if you're on controlled sets, then, you can use lights, etc., to make sure you can get a clean looking image, and no matter what the circumstance is. But next, I'd like to talk about one of my favorite things about the S5, and that's Vlog. I I think at this point, I've gotten my hands on Sony's S-Log, Fuji's F-Log, Apple's Apple Log, and I think Lumix's V-Log is still probably my favorite log profile to work in. Now, this won't be the long-awaited color grading tutorial I know some people have asked me for over the years, and trust me, that will come, and if people really want it, I'm happy to make one sometime this year if you guys think it will be valuable. But given that we're talking about the S5 today, I think I would be wrong not to speak about V-Log and what my thoughts are on it. I think Panasonic already has some of the best colors out of body. So with that, I've always loved the starting point that I've gotten once I convert my footage from log to Rec 709. I've always felt like it's a great starting point to when I'm getting ready to start building whatever my chosen look is for a project. I think with any log profile, exposing your image properly is a big part in what's going to allow you to have a great looking image at the end. I do find myself overexposing slightly. I think you'll find yourself recovering highlights a lot easier than you will with lost information and crushed blacks or shadows. And I think overall, you have this great control over your image. And that speaks to the S5's superb dynamic range. Over the years, I've traveled with this camera and taken it to some beautiful places. And I've always been happy about the grades that I was able to produce with this camera.
And I've always been able to produce a very color balanced image. And that's ultimately my goal with anything that I'm shooting, whether that's a person or a landscape. I want to be able to produce a very organic, natural looking image that has my own unique touch to it.
You know, over the years, I feel like my grading has definitely taken its leaps, and I'm no colorist, but I definitely feel like I've gotten a good grasp on, you know, what works for me. And the S5, I feel like I've just sort of figured it out to where I can just go out and record, and I can come home and use some of my already kind of created looks and just throw it in my footage. And if I need to make any fine-tune adjustments, I can do it, and I can pull and push my image in the ways that I need to. Now, there's definitely a ton more to unpack here about log and grading and all that other stuff. Like I said, if anybody wants a color grading video in the future, I'm happy to make one. I would note though that for a lot of my work, I have used Enhancer in the past and still use it in some sort of fashion today. I do have a discount code that you're welcome to use. I'll put it in the description and I'll put it on the screen somewhere. And I feel free to try it out. I think especially if you're getting into grading, I know DaVinci's color grading tools can be very intimidating. Enhancer is a great way to kind of start creating things without the learning curve. And like I said, I still use it today, and I think it's an absolutely wonderful tool to have within your color grading arsenal. As I said, there's definitely a ton more that we can unpack about color grading and V-Log in general. If you guys really want to see a color grading video for just some tips and tricks about how I've been able to get images look like how I have with the S5, feel free to let me know in the comments, and I'm happy to get one of those in the works for sometime this year. But moving on, one of the other things I wanted to touch on in this video was autofocus. Now, if you're familiar with Lumix cameras, you'll know that over the years, one of their pain points has always been their autofocus system. And the S5, that maybe is its true Achilles heel, at least depending on who you are. Panasonic notoriously used a contrast-based autofocus system versus phase detection autofocus that a lot of the other camera brands use. And since then, all of these new Lumix cameras are all using phase detection autofocus, which I think most of us can agree is just a superior autofocus system. With all of that being said, I'm not actually here to talk down about the autofocus system. I actually think it's quite usable, but you can also take what I say with a grain of salt because I primarily use manual focus lenses. I use cine glass, vintage glass that, I just simply don't really need autofocus. So it's never been too much of a bother for me. But also, my first camera, as I mentioned earlier in this video, was the Lumix G85, which had absolutely unusable autofocus. So when I made the jump to the S5, and having just a little bit of autofocus that worked somewhat decent felt like a game changer for me. And something else that isn't talked about is how well this camera's autofocus works in APS-C mode. It actually works significantly better for whatever reason. I think there's just less of the sensor that the camera needs to focus on, and it just helps the autofocus work better. Not sure. I'm sure there's a technical reason for that, but if you really need some autofocus and maybe you're doing interviews or something like that, then maybe you can try out APS-C mode. But once again, if you're someone like myself who is not going to be reliant on autofocus, you're using cine glass, vintage glass, then autofocus is not a negative for you on this camera. And you nearly have a perfect camera because autofocus is not a factor. I'm even using autofocus right now. I'm using one of my newer lenses, the TT Artisan 40mm, and I've been using autofocus for this entire video. And you can let me know how well it's been going. I think it's been working pretty well. I've been trying to keep an eye on it as much as I can, but yeah, if you haven't seen much focus breathing or haven't noticed any, there you go. Autofocus on the S5 isn't that bad. Now, another really important aspect about this camera is how great of a photography camera this is.
Over the years on the S5, I've done landscape, I've done street, I've done portraits,
And I've never been disappointed about what I can produce with this camera. This camera has a 24 megapixel sensor, which I think is a great resolution. File sizes aren't too big. You do have enough resolution that you can still crop in and have flexibility.
And if you're a long-time subscriber of my channel, you might have seen some of the photography videos that I've made with the S5. I made a video covering a trip down the California coast. I shot primarily most of my images on the Lumix S5. And then more recently, at the top of last year, I made another video covering a trip to the Oregon coast, specifically Cannon Beach. Shot lots of stills on the S5.
And if you're new to my channel, I encourage you to check out those videos and look at some of the images that I was able to produce with the S5. And I don't think you'll be disappointed about how great of a stills camera this is. I think, people can often forget that the S5 is a hybrid camera. The autofocus works great in photography. There's really no negatives for it there. Oftentimes I hear people speaking about cameras that they're looking at getting, and they're saying all these way more expensive options. And I'm like, why not the S5? As great as a video camera as it is, it can do photos just as great. So with that being said, the question of whether or not the S5 is a great camera to buy in 2026,
I think it's a no-brainer that this is still a relevant camera in 2026. Whether you're looking for a cinema camera, a photography camera, or maybe even both, this camera is packed with the necessary features to be whatever you want it to be. And for me, over the years, learning what works for me, making mistakes, and just shooting as much as I can has helped me be successful with this camera. And I still feel like there's so much more room to grow with it.
Now, I have had people ask me would I consider getting the S5 II or maybe another Lumix camera that releases. Absolutely. I mean, the S5 II, to speak on that, I never found that camera too big of a leap from the S5. I think the autofocus was not enough, given the reasons that I explained. I don't really use autofocus. So, having phase detection wasn't enough for me to just do the jump to the S5 II, and I don't really need 6K. Be great to have open gate, but I don't need it. That's never been like a big enough selling point for me to make the jump. I have to say I do love what I saw from the S1 II, but I would still like to see if Panasonic releases, an S1H2, something with an optical low pass filter, maybe some internal NDs. I think the next camera that I would like to buy is something that sort of does it all for me, and then I don't have to consider buying a camera for the next 15 years. And I think most of us can agree that most of these cameras do what we need them to do anyways. If you're finding something that it can't do, you're most likely nitpicking at this point. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Over the years, I've been building my filmmaking career on this, and I still am. I'm gonna still do any professional work on this camera, and I have no problem with doing so. If I see fit and I need to pick up another S5, I would not hesitate to do so. It's an absolutely wonderful camera, and at the price range, you're really not finding a better option out there right now. Hope this video was insightful in any way. Hopefully I provided some sort of value. I'm sure there's a bunch of stuff I missed. So if you have any questions, concerns, thoughts, whatever, let me know in the comments. Happy to interact and communicate any way I can about the S5 or in any other thing that you want to talk about. And yeah, so I think that's all I got. Hope you all have a great day, night, evening, whenever you're watching this, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.